Morning. This is a response to a video by Professor Corey Anton, called Fundamental Ambiguities in Fundamentalism, open bracket, Science and Religion. Hi there, Corey. It's kind of a response, it's more of a riff on something you said, I'm afraid, because you spurred something in me. It's really interesting stuff. And, to what extent can something be both ambiguous and fundamental at the same time? There's something beautifully kind of Ouroboros about that, isn't there? Drill down or reduce down to the singular, hardest, most foundational idea that you have, and somehow you discover that what you found there is made out of cloud stuff or something. That's where I'm going with that. But tangentially to what you were talking about, you're kind of alluding to the evolution of humankind and the evolution of consciousness and those kind of things. And could consciousness not have evolved in us? And it got me to thinking about motor cognition and the evolution of, those proposals for how consciousness and indeed identity came out as a result of us having what Rudolf Linus calls motricity, the fact that our simpler ancestors developed the capacity to move. Because as soon as you got the capacity to move, then you have the opportunity to not just respond to different climatic conditions, environmental conditions, but also to give yourself different survival possibilities according to how you move. If I'm a simple organism and I move into the daylight or I move into the shadow, the choice of which of those places I choose to move to will have a survival impact and by inference a reproductive impact. And following that chain of logic through, what the suggestion is that at a certain point we as organisms began to be able to simulate potential futures. So here I am, a simple organism, confronted with the capacity to move either into the light or into the shade. I run some kind of simulation of what could happen if I do those two things. I imagine myself being eaten by a predator because I'm in daylight. I imagine myself not being eaten by a predator because I'm in shade, and I move into the shade. I'm making that sound like a conscious choice, and maybe it's at a later date in evolutionary development that would manifest itself as a conscious choice. But it's certainly at the stage I'm talking about, that could just be almost a reflex, where a simulated future affects the actions or becomes part of the causal chain of activity about what you do at the moment. So that's the beginning of simulating the future. Yeah, and then simulating potential parallel worlds and moving into one of them. And what Linus goes on to talk about, and other people, is that that's also the beginnings of a kind of identity. Because in these various simulations that a simple organism constructs, there is a kind of avatar that plays those different games, those little virtual games. Here's me going into the shade. Here's me going into the light. There's a consistent entity which is propelled into these potential simulated futures, and so that kind of end of it goes. That becomes the core of a kind of self-identification model. That here I am, remembering myself in the various presents that I place myself in. So far so straightforward, and and that develops. So now here we are with all these various loops of consciousness going on, and all these simulations and all these things that feel like free will, whatever that might mean, and all these choices being made available, and the various weightings that we get. So it just gets enormously complex. But what I'm thinking of is, how does that work in terms of the development of the future? If survival, in purely kind of Darwinian evolutionary terms, is at least partially built upon the capacity of an organism to simulate the future effectively and make good choices based on those simulations. So the more effectively I as an organism can simulate the future, the more I can accurately represent what's going to happen in the future, the more likely I am to survive. To the point where here I am now, and I'm kind of, at least in broad strokes outlines, I'm able to simulate potential 20 years hence, because I am making kind of career choices. I'm making, to the extent that I pay into a pension fund, I'm making kind of investment choices. So I'm kind of even if it's through a glass darkly, I am kind of seeing the future and working accordingly. I mean, what would be the logical development of that? I mean, of course, we'd probably wipe ourselves out in 100 years. But just let's say we weren't. You know, what would it be like? What would consciousness look like if we just became better at that? If we as organisms had that kind of, continued to have that reproductive advantage of those organisms who were better, those amongst us, maybe not be human organisms, but those amongst us who were best able to simulate the future by imagining themselves living in it, if they just got better and better at that. So we or another organism like us might evolve towards a state where it can simulate the future perfectly. So the future holds no mystery to them, and potentially even the future of their offspring, because simulating the future of your offspring brings reproductive advantage, doesn't it? It brings genetic advantage. I am alive today not just because I've done reasonably intelligent things or not too many stupid things, but also because my ancestors, my mother and father and my grandmother and grandfather and so on, they also did at least enough to prepare the ground 2 generations hence. You know what I mean? So maybe if we were to develop a consciousness which could look that far into the future, simulate the future perfectly, what would that be like? I think it would still be ambiguous. I think the ambiguity would be even stronger. Because the future is a blinding mirage, as I keep quoting from Stephen Wyszynski book, which I really like, called The Rules of Chaos. But we'd still be living in ambiguity, wouldn't we? Because the further you look into the future, the further you're able to simulate the future, the more possibilities, the more of a recombinant explosion of possible events occurs, isn't it? So the ambiguity would rise and rise and rise the further forward you can imagine oneself living. And yet we'd still get better at doing it. So yeah, the better our base ability to simulate, the more ambiguity there is. The more we know, the more cloudy it is. Anyway, thanks for that. Not sure if I've made any sense, but you certainly got me thinking. Thanks, Corey. Bye.